Thank you for joining us, everybody, as we continue our look back at the 1990s with the SLIAC All-Decade Baseball Team. Joining us today once again is Terry Logue, Hall of Fame SLIAC, Administrator, SID, a little bit of everything. Thank you for joining us to talk some baseball today, Terry.
It's a great pleasure. Love talking about sports.
When we look at the diamond, the baseball diamond, there's one team in the early part of the decades that really stands out. MacMurray College Highlanders. What can you tell us that you remember about the Highlanders?
Well, the Highlanders were the premier team when the conference started in the 90s. And it starts with a couple of coaches, one that's on the all-decade team, Mark Ziegler. He was a three-time coach of the year, and then he handed the reins over to Tom Lenz, and they just kept rolling. They won 6 consecutive league titles, and they won 4 tournament titles and made the NCAA tournament in 96 and 97.
Yeah, they were quite a stacked program. I mean, you look at this all-decade list team, and, there's several players that stand out. We'll talk about some of the individuals later on, but quite a program they had going there in the 90s. A couple other teams on the baseball field that really stood out, Maryville, Fontbonne, and Westminster. What can you tell us about those 3 programs?
Well, Maryville actually won the first league title in 91. They won 2 league titles and a tournament title. Westminster, captured 3 tournament titles. And then Fontbonne won the league and tournament titles in 98. And they made the NCAA tournament. And, the interesting thing about that is the coach at that time is still in the St. Louis area. It's Darren Hendrickson at St. Louis University.
That's right. Just a couple miles down the road, but still in the St. Louis metro area. So, we mentioned some of the programs. Let's talk about some of the players that still 30 years ago, you still remember from 30 years ago. As I mentioned earlier, MacMurray, several standout players, Kevin Callens, looking down the list, Tony Killeen, Jeff Lane. What are some of the players from MacMurray that you remember from the baseball?
Well, you got to start with Tony Killeen. You just mentioned his name. He was the newcomer of the year in 96. He was a 4-time first-team all-conference performer. To win that honor, you got to be good to be on the first team 4 consecutive years. You had Kevin Callens. He was a 3-time first-team all-conference performer. They had the tournament MVP in 97. That was Ryan Kell. And, you've got a first-team all-conference performer in Brian Smith, a tournament MVP in 96, Mike Sabo. To be truthful, the list goes on and on.
That it does. I wanted to also ask you quickly about another team that we mentioned, Fontbonne, with Ryan Bauer, who actually was the first player from the SLIAC to be drafted by the Major League Baseball draft. What do you remember about Bauer? I know he was a 2-way player, but what kind of player was he? Do you remember him being as?
Well, he was the newcomer of the year in 97 and the tournament MVP in 98. And he was just a player that you loved to watch as long as you weren't playing against him. And he had a brother that was on the team. And, he was on that team that went to the NCAA, coached by Darren Hendrickson.
That's right. And then finally, Terry, what are some other standout players that you remember still today?
Well, if you go down there, you've got Kevin Carl of Maryville. He was a 2-time first-team all-conference performer. You had Mark Valley. He was a 2-time first-team all-conference performer from Maryville. You had actually Neil Buddy of Greenville. He was a 3-time all-conference performer. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention some Westminster players. Dan Bean, tournament MVP in 99. We had John Robinson. He was a 2-time first-team all-conference performer when the conference first started. And he was a great performer at Westminster. And then there's also a 3-time first-team all-conference performer in Jay Custard.
That's right, leading those Blue Jays to 3 titles during that decade. Well, Terry, it's been fun looking back on baseball. Really enjoy it, and we will talk to you again later this week.
Look forward to it.